This episode of The Wood Whisperer is brought to you by FineWoodworking.com, the most trusted source of woodworking information on the internet.
Welcome to the first in a series of collaborative project videos between The Wood Whisperer and FineWoodworking.com. Now, I'm your host, Mark Spagnolo, and as a contributing editor for FineWoodworking.com, I'll not only have the opportunity to produce some great videos, but we'll also provide you with a whole multimedia experience, including text write-ups, detailed photographs, and downloadable plans. Now, for a detailed write-up and downloadable plan for this project, check out finewoodworking.com/thewoodwhisperer. For today's project, we're going to revamp one of the most important tools in the shop, the assembly table. Now, as fine furniture makers, we will always need flat and true surfaces to reference off of. For instance, your table saw fence, your joiner bed, and the sole of your hand plane are just a few of the many items in our shops that we rely on a daily basis as perfect reference surfaces. And even with perfectly milled pieces, our projects can still come out lopsided and crooked if we assemble them on a surface that isn't perfectly flat. Now, a dead flat assembly table will not only improve the quality of your work, but it will also make your woodworking life much less stressful when it comes time for complex glue-ups. Now, just about anything can serve as an assembly table. Something as simple as a piece of plywood and some sawhorses certainly will get the job done. But how do we know that that surface is flat and level? And even if it is, how do we keep it that way? Now, we address these concerns by building what is known as a torsion box. A torsion box is just a simple grid work, kind of like a honeycomb, with a skin on each side. Now, this type of design results in an incredibly strong surface that's resistant to bending and warping and can be found in things like airplanes and doors, where structural integrity is essential. Now, here's a little mock-up that I made out of 1/4-inch plywood. Now, you can see basically the inner grid work, and I missed a little piece here, but there's an inner grid work and two skins, and when you put this together, this is exceptionally strong and basically will not bend under normal usage. Now, I recommend using MDF for your assembly table. MDF stands for medium density fiberboard. It's an engineered product that's very stable, it has no predisposition for movement, and it's uniform from sheet to sheet. Oh yeah, it's cheap too. Now, you could probably get away with using a plywood or a kiln-dried hardwood for this project, but I find that MDF's uniform density makes it the perfect material for a project like this. Now, we're going to be working with a lot of MDF today, so we need to take a few precautions. Now, you should always wear minimally a dust mask, or better yet, a respirator like this one, when you're creating dust in your shop. And since MDF is primarily made up of wood fibers, wax, and resin, its dust can be particularly harmful. Also, MDF dust is very light and it tends to get everywhere. It also has a tendency to make the floor pretty darn slippery. Now, let me give you a tour of my old assembly table and show you some of the features that I like and some areas where we can use some improvement. Now, I'm sure many of you will recognize my old assembly table as being David MARC's design, and I certainly did model mine after his. It's a simple 4-foot by 4-foot torsion box with some maple on the ends for extra durability. Now, the problem that I have with this type of table is that the top really gets beat up over the years. Whether it's dried glue, screw holes, spilled finish, they're all basically the culprits. And now the top, after being refinished a number of times, has some peaks and valleys in it that sort of defeat the purpose of an assembly table like this. So that's one of the things I want to tackle in the design of our new table, is how to get a top that we can actually replace over time and not have to worry about refinishing. Now, one major area for improvement is the base of the assembly table. My original design was just pretty basic. I just wanted to hold the top in place and have some extra storage room. And it worked for a while, but as I accumulated things and tried to make it more and more functional, I started to realize it was just kind of a trap for miscellaneous garbage. So I've got my air compressor under here. I've got a retractable air hose. I've even got this little brown paper roll that you could pull the paper over the top of the table to protect the surface. And on the outsides, I've got some pegboard. So it's kind of nice, but I think we can do a lot better. For instance, one major thing that's a real pain is every time I want to do something that requires power, I need to run an extension cord from one of the walls. It would be great if I could run a permanent extension cord under the flooring or in one of the cracks in the concrete and have some power strips along each side. And I'll actually have easily accessible power on all sides at all times. Maybe one of the biggest things that I'm going to do as a change is instead of just a big wide open space underneath, what I'd like to do is make some really good usable storage. So I'm talking, full extension drawers, some doors, basically cabinets underneath the assembly table. And I'm thinking about splitting it in half so that I actually have, cabinets facing each side. So it'll be a lot of work, but I really think it's going to be worth it, and it's going to help keep the shop much more organized. And now it's time to take apart the old table. Pasta power! Now, to make a dead flat surface, we need to start with a dead flat surface. The method that I use is the one that I learned from the great David MARC. Now, we're going to start by creating a stable work surface using 2 sawhorses, a bunch of 2x4s, and a sheet of 1/2-inch MDF. So let's start by joining the tops of our sawhorses.
After removing the top board from each sawhorse, I joint one edge. This will make sure that I have a flat and true surface to start building my work surface. I only need to joint one side. While I'm at the joiner, I joint one edge of my long 2x4s that will serve as a sub-base for our work surface. These boards need to be a uniform width, so I give them all a few passes through the planer as well. We don't really need to worry about the flat faces of these boards, since they won't really affect our setup. And finally, we trim our boards to roughly 6 feet long. With the sawhorses spaced about 4 feet apart, I begin shimming each leg where necessary to get the top board perfectly level. I do this for both sawhorses. Next, I place my level across the sawhorses to make sure they're in the same plane. Once again, I use shims where needed. I do this on both sides of the sawhorses. I then check to ensure that all 4 sides are still level. Now I can add my 2x4 sub-base. I simply space the previously jointed and plain 2x4s evenly across the top of the sawhorses. I then check each board individually for level. And finally, I check across the boards at each end. If everything looks good, it's time to add the MDF top. With my stepdad's help, I place a full sheet of 1/2-inch MDF on top of the 2x4s.
Now with our MDF on top of our boards, we are 99% there. There's just one more thing that we can do to make sure that this surface is perfectly level. We're going to use a set of winding sticks to make sure that there's no twist in the board. Now winding sticks, it's sort of a classic old way of making sure that surfaces are flat and level. Basically, it consists of 2 identical pieces of material. Now you can use kiln-dried hardwood for this, you can use plywood. I'm actually just using aluminum straight edges that I bought from Home Depot. These were really cheap. It's a full 8-foot straight edge that splits in half into 4 foot each. And I've just taken some blue tape and put it on one edge and some white duct tape on the other edge. Now, you can come up with different ways of using markers or whatever to make contrasting surfaces. The idea is you place one on each end of our surface, and then you bring your sight level down to the level of these straight edges, and you basically close one eye and look across. And you should be able, especially if you have a nice clean background, which mine isn't, so it makes it harder to see. But if you've got a nice white wall behind you, you'll be able to see where the board is either high or low. And if you see a perfect color strip all the way across, you're good to go. But if you see that there's a little bit more blue on one end than the other, that's how you can make your adjustments from that point using your shims. Fortunately, ours was right on, so we don't have to do anything. We can keep going. Now I'm going to do one more thing before we start cutting our strips for the top. I'm going to go around to each leg and secure the shims using hot glue. It's not going to be permanent, we can knock them out later, but it'll help me just make sure in case I kick it or bump into it that it's a lot less likely to move out of place and ruin our perfectly flat surface.
Now it's time to cut our grid strips. I use a circular saw and a straight edge to cut a piece of 1/2" MDF in half, making it much easier to handle. Don't worry, the board is elevated on 2x4s. Setting my table saw fence to 3 inches, I begin cutting the strips. I place the cut side against the fence. When handling large sheets by yourself, be sure to use roller stands and outfeed tables to your advantage. Cut as many strips as possible from the first half sheet, which should be about 15, and then cut 2 to 3 extra strips from the second half sheet. With a little help, I then cut 3 long 3-inch strips from a sheet of 3/4 inch MDF. This material will be used for the outer frame of our torsion box. Now if you don't have a helper, be sure to cut the board down to a manageable size first, before you start making your cuts. I then use my sliding compound miter saw to cut all of the strips to the appropriate length. This includes the outer frame pieces, our short grid pieces, and our long grid pieces. Refer to the plan for exact measurements.
Now my assembly table is going to be roughly 4 foot by 6 foot when completed. The torsion box itself will be constructed with an outer frame of 3/4 inch MDF. The frame's dimensions will be 47.5 inches by 70 3/4 inches. Now the inner grid is going to be composed of 1/2 inch MDF. The grid pieces and the frame pieces will all be cut 3 inches wide, and the inner dimensions of each grid square will be 7.25 inches by 7.25 inches. Now it's important to remember that you can make your assembly table as big or as small as you like. Adjust your numbers accordingly and you should have no problems. So let's quickly review all of our torsion box pieces that we've cut. We've got 2 70 3/4 inch long frame pieces. We've got 2 46 inch short frame pieces. We have 8 46 inch long grid pieces. And then we have our 35 7.25 inch short grid pieces. Now we've also got an extra one here that we're going to use as a spacer during the construction. And finally, I have one extra piece here, and that's for our last row of short grid pieces. We'll cut those last since we may have some cumulative error to contend with at that point.
Before assembling our grid, it's a good idea to wax the MDF work surface so that the glue is less likely to stick. Now it's time to assemble the frame. I use a framing square to align the pieces, and glue and brad nails is all we need to connect them. I then use Rockler's handy little square clamping system to hold the pieces at a perfect 90-degree angle as the glue dries. I repeat this process on the remaining 3 corners. Using my 7.25 inch spacer, I begin assembling my grid. Once again, I use glue and brad nails. I install 5 short grid pieces per row in the same manner. I use the 7.25 inch spacer as a guide and nail the long grid piece to the short grid pieces as well as the outer frame. Assemble each row in the same fashion. Notice how I have to toe nail the small grid pieces into place. Notice how I'm using clamps to keep the grid perfectly square. Also notice that there are a few oopsies in my grid. This is really no big deal as long as everything is square and even. For the final row, I'm cutting each piece individually so the fit is perfect.
Now that the grid work is in place, I just want to point a few things out. First of all, notice all the clamps that I have on here. What started to happen was as I put the grid together, I started to notice that there was a little bit of a bow, and I didn't want that to translate out to the final piece on the end. It would just make the table not perfectly square. So what I decided to do was actually scoot everything down to the corner of my base, my work base here, which is a nice piece of MDF that I already measured the corner and it is square. So I wanted to make sure that my work piece and the grid itself conformed to that piece of MDF. So I essentially just clamped it down in each location to make sure it stays nice and even, and that's going to translate through the rest of the piece. So that squared everything up real nice. Now at this stage, I like to just let things sit for a few hours, let the glue dry, and the whole piece will get nice and rigid so that when we throw our skin on top, nothing's going to move around. It's going to be nice and secure. Now here's a quick tip. If your small grid pieces, maybe sit a little bit higher than they should, if you could feel a ridge with your finger, it's a good idea to get a block plane and just give it a few strokes across. And make sure you remove that, because that will affect the overall flatness of this table when it's all said and done.
Now it's time to add our 1/2-inch MDF skin. I like to cut the piece a 1/2 inch oversized in each direction. I spread a nice bead of glue over the entire grid. Using small strips of MDF as a spacer, I place the sheet of MDF on top of the grid. Once everything is lined up the way I want it, I remove the MDF strips. Using a big drywall square, I draw lines across the top representing the locations of the long grid pieces. Just line the square up with the nail holes on the side. This will serve as a guide for my brad nails. This is not the time to be stingy with your brad nails. Use about 6 to 8 per row. For added reinforcement, I pre-drill and drive some 1-inch screws into the top. Using a flush trim bit, I route away the excess material, leaving the top perfectly flush with the sides. I then like to use a block of wood and some 120 grit sandpaper to smooth the freshly routed edge. Now we need to flip the table over in order to cover the other side. I plan on using the piece of MDF that's serving as our work surface for the other skin, so we need to make sure that we place the wax side out in order to ensure a proper glue bond. I spread the glue like before and add the top skin. The process for securing the top is the same as the other side. Strike a line and fire away with the brad nails. Well, in case you hadn't noticed, I didn't trim the top skin ahead of time. No particular reason, just laziness. I trimmed the excess off with a circular saw and a straight edge, leaving about a 1/4 inch overhang. And once again, I trimmed the top flush with the sides using a flush trim bit and my router. A little sanding, and we're ready for the hardboard top. I pre-drill and secure the hardwood top with 1/2-inch screws. Then it's one more round with a flush trim bit.
Now that the hardboard is secured to the torsion box and trimmed nice and flush, we could turn our attention to the sides. This could work, we could leave it like this, but I want to make it look a little nicer and I want some extra durability. The sides of this table are going to receive quite a bit of abuse as I bump things into it or hit it with a clamp, so a nice hardwood would be perfect for the outside edge. We're going to use some white oak. I've got some left over from a previous project and I think it would be perfect for this. So now I'm going to mill these boards to the proper length and width. And if you have any questions on milling technique, I did cover that topic in my joiners jumping episode, so check out the Wood Whisperer site for more information on that. Now that my oak boards are milled up and cut to length, I'm going to quickly sand the top edge and the inside edge where it meets the hardboard, so I don't have any risks of getting a splinter there. And we don't want to really sand them after the board is in place because it's going to be perfectly flush with the top of the hardboard, and we don't really want to sand the top of the hardboard. So we'll get the sanding done and over with now, and then we'll attach these to the sides.
I pre-drill and countersink my oak strips before attaching them. I spread a good amount of glue on the side of the torsion box, as well as the oak strips. Now here's a cool little trick. I use a piece of scrap MDF as a stop, and this way when I attach the oak strips, there's going to be very little chance of error. Also notice that the clamps are positioned in such a way that they support the oak strip while I secure it with a few brad nails. And finally, I add the screws.
Now we've got some holes to contend with from where we put in our screws. You could use a oak dowel, or you could even get a plug cutter and get some face grain plugs that will blend in really nice and you'll never even see them. Or you can use a contrasting wood to sort of use it as a decorative opportunity. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm just going to use a walnut dowel rod here, cut into little tiny pieces. I'm going to plug the holes that way. Now the edge of our table is a little bit sharp to the touch, so we should probably do something about that. I'm thinking a nice little 45-degree chamfer should do the trick, and it'll make it look pretty nice too. Okay, so now is a perfect time to sand the outside trim of our assembly table. I've got some areas that are a little bit rough and my plugs are still sitting a little bit proud, so it could use a little bit of work. I'm also going to pay special attention to any of these corners and edges, and especially this bottom edge is something we might forget about. That's an area where you may run your hand across and find that you actually give yourself a nice little, paper cut almost from a really sharp corner. So let's make sure we round all those over. So let's talk about the possible finishes we could put on this table. Usually with hardboard, it has one shiny side and one dull side. And usually that shiny side is relatively resistant to glue sticking to it, assuming you wipe it up pretty quickly. Finishes, well, I mean, they'll get on there, but you could wipe them off and it won't damage the tabletop too much. But in this case, this particular material seems a little bit more porous than the hardboard I'm used to getting. So I am going to apply some sort of a finish. Minimally, I would say, take some finishing wax, some paste finishing wax, and give the table a good coat. And that's really going to help immediately stop any glue or anything from sticking to it. And the glue will dry, and usually you can just pop the glue droplets right off. You could go as far as using something like a polyurethane. This is one of my favorite polyurethanes. It's General Finishes Armor Seal. It's satin. It would be perfect for a project like this. You could use even something as simple as just a coat or a few coats of boiled linseed oil. That's a common finish for workbenches, solid wood workbenches. But in this case, I don't know that it's necessarily the right choice. I just want something very simple, quick, fast drying, and that actually will provide a little bit of a film on the surface. So my choice is going to be satin polyurethane.
I start by making a 50% mixture of mineral spirits and Armor Seal. I mix thoroughly and then use a clean cotton rag to apply the finish.
It looks like the Armor Seal left a really nice smooth finish on the hardboard here. The sides definitely could use a few more coats, so I think I'm just going to do maybe 2 more full-strength coats over the entire piece, and this puppy's ready for the shop. Well, here it is, our new and improved assembly table. It's dead flat, and the white oak really dresses it up nicely. I especially like the little walnut dowels. Now perhaps the best part about it is the fact that I don't have to baby the top anymore. I can beat it up all I want, and if the top gets in bad enough shape, I just replace it. So the next thing that we need to do is construct a base, and we'll have future videos covering that topic. As always, if you have any questions about this project, please feel free to email me at thewoodwhisperer@gmail.com. Or you can visit my website at thewoodwhisperer.com.